Hello, Duncan Green here with the latest in the LSE series of short videos on influencing. I want to talk to you today about the Rao and Kelleher framework. This is a way of thinking about power and change especially from the point of view of gender equity, which is what these two academics, Rao and Kelleher, worked on over decades. It will help you understand a little bit more about social norms and moral norms and why they're so important in change and in influencing, and how to use their framework to really get some traction on those social norms and build them into your influencing strategies. Just a quick reminder that social and moral norms are almost the bit of the iceberg below the water. An awful lot of activism is about changing laws, changing spending, changing observable behaviors, things you can measure, bed nets, vaccines, schools, hospitals. That's all important, but underneath those aspects lie massive social norms. Now, the distinction between social and moral norms are social norms are behaviors that people do because they think other people expect it of them. So, you don't beat your child in public because you think other people will disapprove. Moral norms are much deeper. They're about what people think is quintessentially the nature of life. You love your children. You don't murder people. And violating those moral norms is deeply felt and requires and carries a huge cost. Now, the Rao and Kelleher framework, also known as the Gender at Work grid, uses a 2x2, which is an axis, two axes, X and Y. It doesn't describe the whole world, but it's useful in terms of breaking out an issue, helping you get a wider range of ideas of what's going on. The two axes are on the x-axis, the informal world and the formal world. On the y-axis, individual change and systemic change. And by putting those two axes across each other, you generate 4 quadrants. And they also put in some concentric circles in the middle. So the top right quadrant is women's access to resources, tools, seeds, money, housing, cook stoves, whatever it is. Those are almost like the normal target of activism and of development programming. The bottom right is a formal and systemic, is about formal institutions, laws and practices, often the target of activism. We need a new law on domestic violence. We need a new law on women's inclusion on company boards. The top left is on individual change and informal. This is more like Joe Rowland's Power Within. It's about women's and men's consciousness. How do women and men see their relationships with each other, their rights, their responsibilities? And that has a certain degree of overlap into informal and systemic, which are these big cultural norms about and values and practices about things like the position of women in society. So why is it useful? Well, I think partly because certainly in the aid and development sector, which is my own background, activists have often veered towards the right-hand side. They're much more comfortable talking about stuff, handing out stuff, giving people money, making sure people have enough of something, or of changing laws and policies. Rao and Kelleher remind us that it's a bit like what's below the waterline. An enormous amount of important aspects of change are on the left-hand side. It's about changing attitudes, consciousness, social and moral norms. So I think if we keep both in mind, we have a more comprehensive understanding of how change happens. And often change moves around, as I'll show in the next slide. So We Can was an Oxfam campaign and started off in India and spread to the whole of South Asia, where the initial idea was that women would get a pack of images of domestic violence, typical ones that they would experience in everyday life, men on women, mother-in-laws on daughter-in-laws, which is a big problem in South Asia. And they would commit in return for getting this pack to use those images to start conversations with their neighbors. And if their neighbors got fired up by this conversation, they would send off for a pack. It was designed by a group of really amazing Indian feminists, and it exceeded all expectations. By the end of the campaign, 4 million people had sent off for these packs, and the impacts were huge on many communities. Interestingly, half the people who sent off for the packs were men, which was never anticipated, which goes back to this idea that you're always going to have to adapt your strategy because nothing is ever going to be quite how you planned it. But over time, people said, okay, you've got me thinking about domestic violence and women's rights. So now I want to go into formal politics and change the system. So they actually had to campaign and move to the right-hand side of the formal world and the formal politics. It wasn't enough to just do a social norms campaign. So putting that into the Rao and Kelleher framework, things start off in the top left quadrant. This is a enormous amount of work, women talking to women, women talking to men, men talking to women about the issue of violence, right? And that started to shift cultural norms, the practices in communities. But then other things started to happen. Women wanted to get involved in politics, which is bottom right. And that, in order to influence, among other things, that also needed their access to resources like travel, childcare. How could they get involved in politics? So all 4 quadrants were involved, which was not intended, but this is a useful way of understanding how change happens when activism really takes off, as it did in the case of We Can.